Liszt is perhaps one of the best known and most popular composers of piano music. Yet a lot of his works require great technical prowess to play. However, today I'd like to introduce you to a hauntingly beautiful piece called Romance, which is more than accessible to a lot of we amateur pianists. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. This is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists, or indeed of course anybody who loves piano, to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it's your first trip here, then please do consider subscribing. Simply click the little icon in the bottom right hand corner of your screen now, and it's all done for you. Liszt's Romance S.169 is, I'm sure, one of his lesser known pieces. When I searched for it on Adagio, I could only actually find 3 recordings, one of which was by Lang Lang. And in fact, it's the Lang Lang recording that first introduced me to this piece when it was featured by Pianist magazine in their Techniques app. I think that this beautiful piece of music can be played by many of we amateur pianists, and I thought it would be worth doing a detailed tutorial on it. So let's dive straight in. The piece is in E minor, so a single sharp, and it's in 3/4 time. But of course not to be played as a waltz. It's also relatively short at only 77 bars. Liszt marks it as melanconico espressivo, melancholic and expressive. And as soon as the melody enters, you can hear exactly why he marks it as such. However, when learning this piece, I wouldn't start from the beginning, rather I'd jump straight to bar 40 initially. Here we have a reprise of the main melody, but this time in octaves, with a couple of double appoggiaturas thrown in for good measure. I think it's worth spending time practicing the bars 41, 50 and 54 in isolation initially in the right hand. I don't believe you need to get these ornaments to a super fast speed, however they do need to be light and controlled. Once you're happy with them, start adding the remainder of the melody. Pay careful attention to where the right hand doesn't have the full octave, as a note of it is played by the left, and also to where you're going to need to use finger substitution to hold the melody through pedal changes. Now let's look at the left hand of these bars. One word of warning is that this section can feel faster than the beginning. However, note that Liszt simply marks it as a tempo, so back to the original speed after we slowed it down at the end of the first section. However, the fact that it's now 8th note triplets, which when we come to the first section you'll see is just standard 8th notes, and the marking of più agitato, it can give us the inclination to rush a little if we're not careful. At first sight, it doesn't look too difficult. However, I personally found that in reality, it's much harder to control than it first appears. The reason for this, I believe, is in the fact that it isn't a simple arpeggio. In fact, the arpeggio is interrupted in the middle by repeating one of the notes. This is another of those occasions where it's worth spending some time to work out a preferred fingering and note it down in the score. There are numerous options, and I finally chose to predominantly play the bass note with my pinky and then taking the rest in 2 groups of 3. Part of my reasoning is in how Liszt has chosen to notate these notes. Let's look carefully at bar 40, and you'll see this elsewhere too. In the second group of triplets, Liszt actually writes it as a separate 8th note triplet and then 2 further triplets together, rather than the more usual way of joining all 3, as he has for the first and the last beats of this bar. Changing fingers, I feel at this point, adds to that agitated feel he's requesting from bar 38 onwards. I've then chosen to mirror this fingering elsewhere, even in bars 41 and 42 where an unbroken arpeggio is used. I feel this keeps the rhythmic nature of the section more intact. To practice this, once I had defined my fingering, I practiced first in block chords. I find this useful as it helps to get the hand used to the position changes and the shape of the chords under the fingers. Once I felt totally comfortable with this left hand, I also started practicing hands together using the block chords too. Next, to further exercise my left hand and to increase the difficulty a little, I played each bar twice, first as block chords, and then immediately afterwards with just the upward part of the triplets. Finally, once this felt comfortable, I went on to playing each bar 3 times, first block chords, then the upward triplets, and then the full pattern. However, I would also practice hands together with the simplified left hand just having the upward pattern. I found this particularly helpful as it reinforces the jump and gradually increases the difficulty, both hands separately and hands together. I strongly advise that you resist the temptation to move forward from one pattern to the next until it starts to feel more or less effortless. Don't be afraid to repeat individual patterns if you find them more awkward than others. When we start putting the finished article together with both hands, don't forget to pay attention to the polyrhythm. Whilst the left hand is always in triplets, the right hand is often in standard eighth notes. As this isn't an extended pattern as we see in Debussy's first arabesque, the most simple way to practice this I found was to simply mark where a melody note falls between the left hand triplets and also mark where it falls on the triplet. To help you out initially, it's even worth clearly marking this into the score to serve as an aide-memoire. Take your time and practice these bars in isolation. As an aside, I think this is one of the advantages of using digital copies. It's possible to scribble all over them without ever spoiling what's underneath. Some markings such as fingering I'd leave there permanently. Others though you might want to erase later once you no longer need the visual clue. From bar 53 onwards, however, I didn't feel that block chords was an effective practice technique, and I practiced these patterns as written and very slowly at first. Again, choosing the fingering you wish to use is critical here. Ensure you have something you're happy with and write it into your score. I feel that you can really go to town with the dynamics in this section. We have, for example, a sort of question and answer figure, with the melody first in octaves, then in single notes. This lends itself to me to the octave section being played at a higher dynamic than the single note section. I think bars 64 to 67 merit special consideration too. To me, these are the climax of the piece. The build-up of musical tension here is magical, but it also means that our hands need to be even more in control than usual. Fine control of dynamics can induce errors, even Horowitz said as much. So spend lots of time, hands separately and hands together here, until it feels really solid. I advise that you experiment with dynamics as you practice and don't add them later. Now let's jump straight to the end of this piece and look at what I feel is the most difficult bar, which is bar 76. At first sight, you might wonder why I call this out as being the most complicated bar. However, let's look very closely at how Liszt has written this. In the right hand, there are 2 distinct sets of notes. One is a set of rolled chords with the stems pointing down. and the other is a melody line where the stems point up. This melody line is important as it's an echo from elsewhere in the piece where he uses this same basic pattern. I'll admit that the first time I learned this piece, I totally missed this detail. For me, the simple complication was that the chords themselves, if you take everything as being part of a rolled chord, are quite a stretch. At their biggest from F sharp to B natural, which with my hand span isn't simple to negotiate given the intermediate notes. However, when you add in the fact that you need to make a melody sing from within the chord, the difficulty factor for me at least increases tremendously. Then add that little staccato marking on the top and it goes off the scale. Voicing a note inside a chord is something I've learned how to do before. However, voicing from within a rolled chord is totally new to me. To practice this, I started practicing the melody line alone with my intended final fingering. I felt this was important to reinforce into my mind which notes were actually in the melody as I see them on the keyboard. I've then gone for super slow practice, focusing on overly emphasizing the melody note and trying to keep the final B natural as light as possible. I set myself the target of practicing just this bar for 3 to 5 minutes a day in this way. Luckily, given that Liszt has twice before this bar indicated where to slow down, I think we can use a little poetic license to keep this at a speed we can manage. The left hand is equally not so easy for me. The obvious way to roll this chord would be to use 5-2-1. However, for me, this isn't really a workable solution, and so I've opted for 5-1-2, which takes a little more practice to keep even and avoid the top note being somewhat bumpy. Only once we feel that these sections are getting into a good shape would I then move to the start of the piece. Our feet are going to be busy in this piece as we're advised by Liszt that we're to use the pedal and equally to add the una corda pedal. Of course, the true benefit of una corda is only there if you have the luxury of playing on a grand piano. If you're unfamiliar with this term, it's speaking about how the left-hand pedal on the piano works. On a grand piano, as you depress this pedal, the entire action of the piano is moved to the right by a fraction of an inch, such that when the hammers hit the strings at the treble end of the piano, where each note has 3 strings, the hammer strikes only 2 of them. This creates a beautiful effect for 2 reasons. First, as only 2 strings are struck, the overall volume is lowered. However, in my view, this pedal is not to be used to make things quiet. That's possible with the fingers alone. However, the most significant thing is that because the dampers aren't moved, all 3 of the strings will vibrate together, the 3rd string in sympathy, if you like, with the other 2. And this is what creates an amazingly mellow tone, even if you strike the key relatively hard. Having practiced the octave section, we're now very familiar with this beautiful melody. You'll notice that Liszt predominantly uses grace notes here rather than the double appoggiaturas in the octave section. The first thing to note with the accompaniment though is that it's shared between the hands. The split can be readily recognized from the score where half, the first 3/8 notes in each bar, is written in the bass clef and the other half, the second 3/8 notes, in the treble. However, I feel it's worth here taking some time to work on the different groups of notes where the right hand has both a melody and accompanying triplets to play simultaneously. The occurrences I found most tricky myself are in bars 7, 9, 16, 17, 19 and 21. I practiced each of these first with just the right hand and then with both hands. However, before putting the entire section hands together, I'd first spend some time working on bars 27 to 30. This introduces us to the piece's climax in a lower register and sets the scene for later. It's definitely worth spending some time practicing this carefully in isolation. I don't know why, but I found the right hand of bar 29 gave me particular trouble. Now, perhaps it was due to lazy practice when I first started to learn this piece. I got into the very bad habit of just playing through and not fixing mistakes as they happen. As a result, mistakes seem to get ingrained into my fingers and hard to shift afterwards. And you might want to watch the video link below on this topic. Bars 31 to 34 are basically the same as bars 68 and 71. The reason I advocate practicing them here rather than when learning the second section are to avoid the temptation to keep playing through to the end before those broken chords we discussed are perfectly controlled. Now, however, that we have covered all the most difficult parts, I think it's time to start practicing in longer sections. We can start by practicing the first section right to the tricorder marking in bar 38. Tricorder, as you might guess, means that we now lift the una corda pedal and go back to letting the hammers strike all three strings. When learning this piece, I'd recommend following the sections as I've covered them in this video and probably in the same order. I'd also spend lots of time on bar 40 onwards initially until the left hand feels comfortable. I still feel I can improve this, and I still use the exercises I describe here when practicing this piece. Whilst I only found 3 recordings of this on Adagio, including the Lang Lang performance, there are others available on YouTube, and as always, I highly recommend you listen to as many other people play this piece as you can, so you can get ideas to steal. I hope that this has inspired you to tackle this beautiful piece of music by Liszt. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.